This room is terrible on my hearing aid, so
No reason for you guys to cluster out. I invite you guys to
somebody
spread
translate
out
for me.
along the rail.
She's just
Come on
asking people to
down.
spread out. She's just asking people to spread out.
That's all. You sound great. Jen. You sound awesome. But you guys can just come on down and spread out along the railway.
We're trying to guess people's words to see more of Queens. So if you want to go ahead with questions.
How many of you are familiar with downtown Flushing? Yeah, some of you. All right. Flushing is one of the oldest settlements, not just in Queens, but in the city of New York. It's founded as a town by the Dutch in the 1640s, and it's originally called Vlissingen, which was anglicized to Flushing after the British took control of the Netherlands. Urban Renewal when Flushing was still a Dutch town, Peter Stuyvesant was not a big fan of different religions, and he wished that the whole colony had reformed the worship in the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the state church of Holland, although Holland, more than any other European country, was quite tolerant of other religions. But they'd already let in some of the Catholics, and they'd already let in the Jews, and he said, no, Quakers. Quakers were coming to Flushing. And Stuyvesant instigated an injunction against the Quakers and said the Quakers can come, but they can't worship in their faith. And anybody that helps them worship or allows them to worship in their space will be put in jail. Well, that happened. And the citizens of Flushing at that time, who were not Quakers, rose up against Stuyvesant in a perfectly peaceful way and issued something called the Flushing Remonstrance. Go Google it, and you can read the whole thing. It's an amazing document that is the forerunner to the First Amendment of our Constitution, guaranteeing freedom of religion. And it starts here in Flushing, here in Queens, the most significant event that we have here. The original document is in the State Museum of Albany, but let's see, it was 2007, which was the 350th anniversary of that document, and it was brought here to stay in the Flushing Library for a few months. And there were a number of celebrations of that document, including a gathering of descendants of some of the people who signed that document. In front of the armory on Northern Boulevard, there is a sign, one of the nice signs of historical stuff in downtown Flushing. In front of that armory, there's a sign that says it was on that property when it was Michael Milner's house in the 1650s that document was signed. And that's the birthplace of the Flushing Remonstrance. And this is the first time in the Western world when freedom of religion came from the bottom. In a couple of places in Rhode Island, it came from the top, but it only included all Christians. In the Flushing Remonstrance, it came from people, and it included Hindus, and it included Jews. And I think if they had known about Buddhists, they would have mentioned them too. So that's the Flushing Remonstrance here in Queens. And what that led to was a Quaker community in Queens. And if you know the Quakers, they're usually on the very liberal side of most major new movements. And by the beginning of the 19th century, in the 1800s, the Quakers came out strongly against slavery and abolition. And they helped slaves escape from the United States into Canada. There were underground railroad stations in Flushing and in Brooklyn and other places where the Quakers were established. But among other things, they assisted a black community establishing itself in Flushing, uptown, on the plateau near Union Street. If you're familiar with Flushing, there are actually two on the Main Street, and then the land rises again up to Union Street, and if you know the Bound House, that's at Bound Street, and now you're in what historically was the wealthiest part of Flushing until through the 19th century. And the blacks that existed before that were mostly in the lowlands, like in Jamaica. But the Quakers helped a church establish itself in 1811, and that's Macedonia AMA, Macedonia African American
Methodist.
Methodist Episcopal Church, and there were other such churches around, but the one in Flushing got established in uptown Flushing and had an integrated neighborhood around it from 1811 until 1952. That was an integrated neighborhood of both the whites and blacks living in it. And I know some people who were living there in 1952 before the whole neighborhood was torn down by an urban renewal project that Robert Moses instigated to make a parking lot and bring Flushing into the automobile age. If you're familiar with Flushing, you know that there's a department store on Roosevelt Avenue, also going up on the hill. It's now a Macy's. It was originally a Gertz, and Gertz was the department store in Jamaica, and this was in 1952. Gertz wanted to build a department store in Flushing. Very convenient to the subway, very convenient to the new parking lot that the city was building. And guess what was on the land that Gertz was built on? Now, Macy's. That was the bus terminal in Flushing. It used to be a civilized bus terminal in Flushing. And you could wait in the bus terminal for your bus. And you could change in the bus terminal for other buses instead of standing on the street in the polluted air with no shelters. Because the sidewalks of Flushing are way too narrow to have bus shelters. So in 1952, the black and white community that lived on that area is between Union Street and 138th Street and 37th Avenue and 39th Avenue was torn down, and the miserable parking lot one was built. Also a little passageway, another building was taken out, a little passageway was torn out to connect the municipal parking lot with the new Gertz department store. That's Linden Plaza. That's a little cut to get you to the subway from the parking lot or to get you to the department store. So who are the winners? The department store wins, and the automobile drivers win. Who are the losers? The pedestrians and the bus drivers and the community that had been living there for generations, black and white, who had to move. Where did they go to? In those days, public housing was largely segregated. And there were two public housing projects that were built at about the same time. One is the Bland houses, which was built on industrial land between College Point Boulevard and Prince Street in downtown Flushing, on the other side of Main Street. Mostly blacks went there, practically all black. That was practically an all-black housing project. Some blacks and mostly whites moved to the Panorama public housing project, which is opposite Queens College, and that was white. So what happened was, an integrated community, just like in Detroit, got segregated. And west of Main Street in Flushing became a black area, and the white area developed at Queens College. That's an urban renewal project. And that happened in so many places where some segregation was yielding to was happening, but urban renewal reversed the process completely. Has Paula been pointing out to you?
I have that. I put it in.
Okay, thank you, Paula. So the yellow flag is not quite where we are. We're in that gray rectangle. And to the right of the gray rectangle, those pink houses, those are the Bland houses. And if you can go up Main Street, you see the cluster of...
They're right here. They're
Up
right here.
there, opposite Queens College, which is a kind of an open area. And go in. That's Panorama housing. And so that became the white public housing, and Bland became the black public housing. James Bland, by the way, was a black jazz musician.
So the flag is in the wrong place, and I can tell you why. So the way we did this project was actually by sending a creative information law request to the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Housing Preservation and Development is slum clearance. But this project was a parking lot on purpose, right? Nobody was ever going to build or preserve housing on this lot. It has completely fallen through the cracks, right? It may be somewhere in Department of Transportation's records. At the moment, the Economic Development Corporation has site control as they do review of any property that they think they can turn over into private development. And they have actually put out a request for proposals for something called Flushing Commons that will actually turn this municipal parking lot 1 into a residential community again, but an upscale residential community, very different than the community that was displaced in the 1950s.
And then the Bland houses now, the demography of the Bland houses is very integrated. It's predominantly black, but there's a sizable Asian community and the sizable Hispanic community and the white community, if you want to believe all those terms. All in one public housing project. It's changed. And Roosevelt Avenue, which in the 50s and 60s was catering mostly to black consumers who lived on the other side of Main Street, is now all Asian. So that's all changed again. But I'm going to end this right where I began this, but 25 years later, in 1964, during the Second World's Fair. During the Second World's Fair, this was created. And this was created by Robert Moses, mostly to show the world all that he did for the city. And if you don't know, Robert Moses was the most powerful man in New York. He was never elected to anything, but if he didn't want something, chances are it didn't get done, and vice versa. He was simultaneously the head of the Housing Authority that built public housing, the head of transportation that built all the bridges and expressways, and the head of the parks that built all the parks. So he pretty much controlled all of that. And if that didn't fit, if you were into something that didn't fit into his plans, it didn't happen. And very few people beat him. Jane Jacobs beat him when he tried to build an expressway across Manhattan. And Nelson Rockefeller beat him when he tried to locate the UN in Flushing Meadow Park. Rockefeller said, no, we've got land for you here in Manhattan, and therefore we can keep all the goodies about the UN in Manhattan, and the delegates will live there and all that stuff. But ironically, what happened, the real UN, which is the mixed demography of the borough, it lives all around the park and plays all their games in the middle of the park and has all their celebrations here in Flushing Meadow Park. So it's just very, very ironic. 64 World's Fair, this is one of the major exhibitions. And if you look around where you see all the red brick color clusters, those are the public housing projects. The bridges are very prominent, the expressways are very prominent, and the parks are very prominent. And practically all of that are Moses' achievements. So this was a tribute to himself. And it's also a very interesting, I mean, I like coming here and I like talking about it. And I teach geography of New York City, and my class always visits this place. It's really special. Robert Moses, by the way, is a very controversial figure. I credit him with being something that New York City lacks. He was a damn good geographer. He understood the land issues. He wanted to do things that maybe a lot of people didn't want to see done, but he understood how the city was constructed. That's all I have to say, unless you've got some questions.
We save questions for the end. Thank you so much, Jack, and I hope you'll come with us to the other end of Queens. We're going to meet Kalin Callaghan, Kalin Murray. Wait, where are you? Can you see her?
As they say, I've been organizing around the remaining urban renewal area, and actually my father was really active in organizing around the western part of the urban renewal area in the 80s. So I can speak a little bit about that and sort of give some context into where we're at today. So there's that red square down there, right?
Yeah.
So let's look at, this is our east, this is what remains. On the other side, which probably needs to be updated, I guess. There's houses there now, actually.
The Panorama was last updated in '92, except for pieces that people have bought to add to the Panorama. Brooklyn Bridge Park is there. There's more of Brooklyn Bridge Park on the Panorama than there is in real life. But no one's paid for these houses yet.
So, that's cool, thank you. So in the 80s, Forest City Radnor won a bid to develop the western portion of the urban area. The borough president at the time, Claire Shulman, was known to be a big fan of developers, a big friend to developers and all types of development. And the former head of the DEP was actually he sort of moved from his civil servant position to his developer position, and there was a lot of kind of behind the scenes. It seemed like stuff happening where this big development was being pushed through, and it was calling for 10,000 units of housing. And to put that into perspective, Starrett City is 6,000 units of housing, and Co-op City is 15,000 units of housing. So on this little strip of land, 10,000 units of housing would really change a lot. And the EIS came out, and again, this is stories that I've heard from, I was a little kid. Right? But I remember the organizing happening, and I remember being at meetings and rallies and stuff, and I've heard my father speak about it a lot, so I'm kind of repeating what I've heard so many times from him. So when the EIS, the Environmental Impact Study, came out, my father was on the community board at the time, and he was really the only one who read it. And it was pretty much spelled like doom for Rockaway. It was dozens of traffic hotspots, insufficient open space, not enough classroom seats, shadows on school buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so he was kind of fighting against this, what are you all talking about? This is crazy. He ended up being removed from the community board for that reason from the borough president, which, side note, community boards are super undemocratic. Community board members are appointed by elected officials. They're not voted. So that's something else. That's another discussion. So anyway, there was some really cool organizing that happened in this fight. One of the tactics was a group of community activists wrote a musical called Urban Musical, which they performed on the steps of City Hall in full beach gear, surfboards, and cool stuff like that. At one time, there was, who was it? One of these, there's a restaurant on the bay, and the developers were having a big party there, and all these activists crashed the party by boat, dressed all in black, and they came into the party. And also, the kind of cool guerrilla tactics were happening. Ultimately, as much as I like to think that this is what caused that plan to fail, I think really it fell of its own weight because it was so ill-conceived. So, that was in the late 80s. Okay, can you still hear me like that? It's on. Okay, so fast forward a little bit, Urban by the Sea ended up being what ultimately was built there. People, it was certainly, there's a lot of two-family homes. A lot of the activists that had been involved in the fighting with Ratner, I think, were sort of burnt out by this time, so they kind of moved on. Some of them passed away. It was sort of okay. There wasn't much of a fight against it, although there's definitely clear sentiment in the Rockaways that it wasn't really built for the existing community. There's a lot of $1 houses that are on the beach that are really beautiful, but
yeah. I'm just going to change that a little bit. I'm just going to jump in. You can actually read a little bit about the Urban project on the wall over here. The project was built as affordable housing, but it's affordable for people making up to a very high income level. So we use area median income to set affordability standards, and this particular project went right up to the ceiling that HUD sets, that the Federal Housing Urban Development Agency sets. There was a strong community preference. The idea was that 50% of the residents of this development would be from the community district in Rockaway, but because the income levels were so high, right, there was a minimum and a maximum. In the end, only 10% of the people who have become homeowners in this area had an address in the community district before they moved here. Not because there wasn't a preference for those people, but because people in this district make about half or 1/3 on average than the income guidelines that were actually set for this project. So even though there was a preference for people from the district, none of them qualified.
That's an important point. Thank you, Colin. Also, I think you really looked at the numbers. A lot of folks from the western end of the Rockaways actually bought houses there. There were less from east residents from the east end who ended up moving into Urban East. And there was a community benefits agreement, in quotes, that was put into place, but it was put into place by a state senator. And what we know about community benefits agreements is that they're really only binding if they're from the community, and that when they come from elected officials, they're not legally binding. So a lot of the things that were included in them, such as there will be a school built, and before that school is built, you can't build west of 73rd Street. Well, all west of 73rd Street has been built up with housing, but there's still no school. There was, a Stop and Shop was built as part of we're giving back to the community, but it's not like a worker-owned, cooperative supermarket. It's like a corporate entity. There's a YMCA, which is great, it's beautiful, but there's a lot of folks I hear a lot, and it's so expensive, a lot of people can't afford it. So there's, certainly the developers made out pretty well with Urban by the Sea, and I think that there's a lot of a feeling of that the community sort of got the short end of the stick, as they have for decades, right? So now we can kind of fast forward a little bit more to Superstorm Sandy. October 2012 hits, totally devastates all of Rockaway. And through the sort of immediate relief efforts that were happening afterwards came grassroots organizing happening. And people that, the social infrastructure it became clear how important that was for us to be resilient as a community. And really what that is the relationships we have with one another, right? And we sort of had no choice but to strengthen those relationships because we needed to get outside and find some food and figure out where the dust masks were and where the shovels were and all this sort of pouring out into the streets and talking with our neighbors. Organically, a lot of organizing started happening. Rocket Wildfire, which is the organization that I work with, grew out of that. It was Occupy Sandy and local residents and leaders sort of and there's some Bregs here today, because they were one of the very first. And Sal is here, and out of a church in Far Rockaway that was a relief hub, there were a lot of friendships really just developed. And people started talking about what are the issues facing the Rockaways? There's so many, there have been so many for so long. The storm has just compounded all of this. Thank you. And so we started to think about what are our solutions? What are the local solutions? How do we address these things? A lot of the conversation led towards land use, because we know that there's so much vacant land in the Rockaways, and particularly these 81 acres. And we were hearing a lot of murmurs of it's going to be development is coming to what's called Urban East. No, it's actually Edgemere South, but they call it Urban East. So we started making some inquiries and trying to figure out what was going on. Were they actually going to develop this? Was there going to be a need for a ULURP? Called up Paula. Paula, what do you know about this? Who should we talk to? And she actually sort of referred us to the Urban Justice Center, where we went and learned about community benefits agreements. And it sounded like something that would be very fitting for our community. So we took that, Rocky Wildfire took it on as our really first campaign, was to develop a community benefits agreement for Urban East. So we've been working on that for 2 years, and really what that started out, what it looked like was knocking on hundreds of doors, doing lots of community meetings and forums, inviting people in to let people know what a CBA is, what type of things you can ask for or demand, depending on how you look at it, what are our needs, what are our wants, etc. It's been 2 years. A very important part of the CBA campaign is that we knew we were going to need to grow a coalition, because it couldn't be one little Rockaway Wildfire group saying we want a community benefits agreement. The developers are going to sign on with us. We need a really broad coalition of community organizations, as many as we can get, to sit down together and say, we're going to agree to our terms, we're going to apply the necessary pressure to the elected officials and to the city and to the developers. And so we're actually really in the thick of that process right now. We're literally writing bylaws for our coalition, which is shoot me in the head, but it's good because we're doing it. And the Rockaways have been traditionally a very divided community, which is pretty, I think pretty intentional if you look at the history of the Rockaways and the redlining that took place, the blockbusting that took place, the white flight, the super stratified, like racially, socioeconomic stratification that exists. It's tough to organize there, but so I think that it's been really an interesting journey of getting to where we are now, which is we have like a solid group of organizations that are really looking at making sure that all these people that live in these houses and buildings who have been struggling for quite a while, you know, geographically isolated, without many of the services that we needed, without jobs anywhere nearby, that they benefit from the development of our public land, basically. And at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's our public land. So that's sort of where we're at now.
Kalin, can I ask you to talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, see that yellow triangle? My building's like 2 buildings over from that one. I actually live in the Mitchell-Lama Co-op. And yeah, I thank God for Mitchell-Lama.
What is that?
Okay, so Mitchell-Lama Co-op is like, it's subsidized housing. Actually, my father had the good foresight of putting me on the list. It took about 8 years for us to be called. At that time, I was married and had 2 kids, so we all moved in. And it's a pretty great model, successful model of affordable housing. And you know, it would be great to have you kind of looking at that model. In many, you know, the Urban East, the plans for Urban East and our visioning for it, there's so many pieces to it. There's like the job training center, there's the community space that we want, there's also the housing. And so we're kind of looking at models that have worked. We're looking at community land trusts. Could that be? Is it possible to actually get something like that? We were here last week, and the folks from Cooper Square were here, and so inspiring, incredible story. And we're looking to, you know, so we've been sort of studying them, and now we met them, and so we're developing friendship. We've been talking to them about, is there potential to bring a model like that to Urban East? So we want to look at like what has worked. Mitchell-Lama has worked pretty well, although some of them are being privatized. They were talking about that last week too. That's a little scary. That's another story.
Thank you, Kalin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to invite you guys actually to keep walking down the ramp, and I'm going to point out one more bit of Queens urban renewal history. Maybe with Jack's help, we'll just take one last look at Willard's Point that brings us into the present, and then we can all go back up to the history gallery and have a discussion, answer questions. There's a great live campaign happening in Rockaway that needs your help. So go speak to the bottom of the ramp, and then we'll continue. Day vision for what's going to happen there?
Oh, can you share the vision for Willets Point? What's Willets Point going to be?
I've been asked to comment on what Willets Point is going to be. But Willets Point itself, which is Fort Totten, is going to be what it is. It's a city park now. That's the real Willets Point. In history, the Willets family had a farm, which was bought by the government to build Fort Totten at the time of the Civil War. That's the real Willets Point. What we call Willets Point is called that because there's a street called Willets Point Boulevard that connected the mouth of Flushing Bay to the entrance to Little Neck Bay. And that street exists still in Flushing and Whitestone. It goes through a nice area of Flushing and Whitestone. But it's interrupted on one end by the Whitestone Expressway, a Moses Road, and on the other end by the Cross Island Parkway, another Robert Moses Road, so it doesn't go through its whole 19th century route anymore. The area that we now call geographical misnomer, and as a geographer, I can't stand it, but I have to yield to the fact that that's what people call it, is in transition. What the city has done is use eminent domain to get rid of all the chop stops there, but they're still there. I did a tour of Wills Point as part of this exhibition 2 weeks ago. We did a walking tour of Wills Point. I've done that about 5 times. And most people do not understand the geography there and the ecology there, which is extremely complicated. The worst thing about Wills Point is the fact that, I hate even using the term, where all the chop stops are, that's existed since the first fair. That's private property, where all the construction jobs held out.
Talking to the microphone.
Okay. Where all the chop...
No, that was good. No, that was good. That was
the Iron Strand, which is the only part of the whole area that is not part of Flushing Meadow Park, has existed as private property ever since the first World's Fair. And that's where all the construction firms hung out with all their equipment during the construction of the fair. After the first fair, that property got converted into an automobile service area. And plus some other things that went on. Some of the buildings there and some of the businesses there exist since the time of World War II. But they're gradually being removed by the city. They're not using eminent domain, they're using money and reconstruction help to get rid of it. One of the big problem there is ecology, because the area never had paved roads. At least they stopped paving them, and it never had sewers. So still with all that automobile repair facility, oil leaks and all kinds of things go into Flushing Creek, which goes into Flushing Bay, which is a very polluted waterway in the city. And supposedly, what the new project will remediate whatever they do, they're going to have to remediate that entire area. And the idea has been, there's been so many plans and other plans. The current plan is to make that area mostly into parking. Remember?
I just wanted to bring that back.
Mostly into parking, and instead develop an area which is actually part of Flushing Meadow Park, but is under the control of the Mets. And that's the parking lot for City Field, which is on the other side of City Field. And the idea is to develop that into a shopping mall, which everybody needs because we don't have enough shopping malls. There are only about 6 in Flushing.
So we begin with the parking lot and we end with the parking lot in Queens, but maybe not. Though, as Jack said, we went on a tour to Willow's Point 2 weeks ago. And although some of the auto repair places are still operating, about 2/3 of them are shuttered. And it's very, very difficult to organize in an area where everybody lives, in an area where every day your people have to work. So I don't know what the future of Willow's Point is really going to look like. But we're lucky to have the force of Robert Wildfire and the Upward Coalition to be here with us today to talk really actively about the future of the Rockaway Peninsula. So I'm going to invite you guys to take another look around and then join us upstairs. The fastest way to get there is past that wall that says organize, down the little stairs, and then up the stairs to the 2nd floor. We can sit down again, and it's a little bit hard walking around in here for hours. So meet Kalin and Jack and I upstairs to the Municipal Gallery, burning questions, organizing strategies, and need help. See you up there.
And also about the open space stuff, the land acquired by Sandy. The Sandy, the land acquired as a result of Hurricane Sandy.
Maybe I should answer both.
There isn't any, the second one. The answer to the second one is land acquired after Hurricane Sandy has been acquired by private developers who are buying it on a speculative market. Land prices keep going up, but they've actually kind of plateaued too. They're not going up as fast as some people thought they would. There was a lot of talk of government buyouts, but those state buyouts for the creation of wetlands are very, very limited to a couple of communities in Staten Island who have actually been advocating for a buyout of those neighborhoods long before Hurricane Sandy hit. They were already organized and saying, yo, nobody should ever build houses here. Like, and so Sandy was the trigger to actually get them what they wanted, which was a buyout of those properties. There's a city option in the Build It Back program for an acquisition for redevelopment if you just can't handle getting your house up to code and if it was more than 50% destroyed by the storm. As far as I know, only 3 property owners have chosen that option. It is not being presented very much, and those are all in Staten Island as well. All of the other property changing hands post Sandy is changing hands with private entities.
And CLT, for us, it's really just like seed stage right now. Like we're just trying to learn about what community land trusts are, and can we figure out a way that it will make sense to the developers and be in their interest, and to the city, and that we can like come to both of them and be like, this would be a good idea for you too, and here's why. So there's like math involved in that, and like
It's not that complicated.
Well, thankfully we've got like all that, and we've got like people who have worked on community land trusts, helping all of us along with that. People from like
So is the big walk for wetlands?
No, the big one.
Walkways?
Well, the project proposal is based on an environmental impact statement that was done in 2003 and contemplates 1,500 units of new housing and community facilities. And the city's pushing that forward and actually awarded the development rights in 2006 to the team that's choosing to exercise them now post Sandy. They actually in 2008 said, no, the stock market sucks. We're not doing this, and then post Sandy they came back and said, actually, if there was resiliency money to put in the infrastructure, the sewers, the electrical grid, to actually create this neighborhood, yeah, we're in. We'll do this because it won't be all out of our own pockets. Whereas in 2008, it seemed so there is a development team.
There's a conservation component though.
So, and then there's a portion of the plan that will be even under the environmental impact statement from 2003 that will be preserved as sand dunes, about 30 acres. And that's actually not really up for grabs because unless they want to start over with the environmental impact study that contemplates doing something else with those 30 acres, there are 30 acres of dune preserve in the plan. But the other 50 acres are up for grabs, right? And if in a world where there is no intervention, those 50 acres become luxury beachside housing, hotels, and pied-à-terres that are owned by people who are not, Rockaway residents that are not New Yorkers, and it's it's a beautiful piece of land. And if you really can build something that is resilient to the elements there, and you can, right? You would want to make it as expensive as possible.
And it would be like exactly what Jack was talking about, the size of the tracks, like very little, like tracks divide, luxury housing here, identity projects there. It would be that.
And so proposing a community land trust is one way to control that, and also proposing other income guidelines for who gets to live in that housing and other mechanisms, but not just for the first round of tenants, but forever, right? Or for as long a time as possible.
Can you get a building permit if you can't get floodplain insurance?
Yes.
And I am much more optimistic than they are. And it's because I'm in Queens. And people get along better in Queens. There's a different dynamic here than there is in the other. Queens is not the new Brooklyn. Queens is the new Queens. And growing up in Queens in the 50s and 60s, while all these other areas in the city, particularly Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, neighborhoods started falling apart. There was a vast immigration of poor blacks from the South, the Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico, changing the demography. People were afraid of that. They moved to Queens. Why? because they could move into a new apartment house. They could get away from that, but more, they could move into a new apartment house that supported air conditioning, and they had a garage to put their cars, and they could buy a 3-family house or even a new ranch house. There was so much housing for the middle class in Queens at that point.
But Queens also didn't experience, hold on a second though. Queens also didn't experience the disruptions of the urban renewal programs
That's what he's
that
saying.
Central
That's exactly what
Brooklyn,
I'm saying.
right, no, exactly, but it
But the
wasn't
other
just,
thing that concomitant to that is my generation, which became matured, let's see, when did I? It's in the early 60s, when I'm 21, that many of my friends in Queens are marrying for the first time. And they married within their own ethnic group. In those days, you married within your own ethnic group. Within 2 or 3 years, most of those marriages fell apart, and they married somebody else. That happened in Queens. That was Queens in the 60s. The Jewish marriages fell apart. The most stable ones seemed to be the Jewish-Italian marriages. And the Italians who would never marry an Irish started even marrying Irish. But there were probably more Italian-Jewish marriages than Italian-Irish. It happened in Queens. And Queens already had a lot of mixed people of mixed color. Like there were, West Indians didn't buy into our whole racial thing. Harry Belafonte and Malcolm X were living in East Elmhurst in an integrated neighborhood. The neighborhood never became a ghetto. That neighborhood, blacks came into that neighborhood because of the Grand Central Parkway. Grand Central Park used to be a very wealthy neighborhood. People used to have, wealthy people lived on Ditmars Avenue, Ditmars Boulevard, and they had a beach, private beach on Flushing Boulevard. Moses took that away when he built the Grand Central Parkway. Those people moved out someplace else, and the blacks could come from Harlem. The middle class blacks, the ones that were in the entertainment business, could get there in 10 minutes. And that integrated East Elmhurst. And it is still an integrated neighborhood, but more with Hispanics than with whites. It's a remarkable neighborhood. There were integrated neighborhoods in Queens, much more so than in other boroughs, and partly because migration is always selective. It's not, the people who move to one place are not the same as the people who move to another place. And in Brooklyn, things were always tougher. Bronx, things were tougher. Manhattan, things were tougher. So Queens has always been a gentler thing. Nowadays, I meet people under 40. And very often I meet the guy or the gal who are married, and I never meet their spouse until one day I meet their spouse. And oh, they've got an integrated kid. I mean, whether it's Hispanic, whatever. You know, Jose Serrano, I met Jose's wife. There's so many people either living with or married to, and it's greater in Queens than any place else. Even if you use the census data, 7% of people in Queens in the 2010 census reported their race as mixed race. And we only had the mixed race category since 2000. So
It's really hopeful.
different
It
dynamic.
is very hopeful, but I think I heard under your breath like that there is something different because
Yeah, well, what you were talking about were like the gentle migration patterns in Queens, I think, wasn't so gentle in Far Rockaway. Because there was a lot of, it was interesting
I
because
mean,
there's
that had something to do with migration. That wasn't people from Queens. That's people being put into public housing
Yeah.
projects from someplace else. So that's the system.
and then a lot of people
But not where
hightailing it out
people are
of
making
there.
their own decisions.
Yeah, it's interesting because earlier I wasn't here for the Lincoln Center, but I know a lot of folks from Lincoln Center were sent to Far Rockaway. And there's also an interesting book for anyone who's interested in like the history of Rockaway, sort of social and political history, called Between Ocean and City. It's written by Kaplan, and they say that for years there was like sort of informal policy of New York City to any people who were problematic residents of NYCHA, of the city public housing, were faced with two choices: be evicted or be sent to the projects in Far Rockaway.
Yeah, well, that's part.
And
And
that
then
was
how
like
do they
sort of
get to
like
work from there?
Right.
But one other thing, and this is the reason I'm so optimistic. 25 years ago, there was a book written by a man named Roger Sanjay, who was on the anthropology department at Queens College. And I recently ran into him, he's retired now. The book is called The Future of Us All. And it's about Elmhurst, which is a very, very mixed neighborhood. And he talked about how Elmhurst saved itself by a coalition of different ethnic groups, very, very mixed, and finally learned to live together and to push for. the government for various things. And one of his conclusions is that women are the leaders of this stuff. And I've become almost a feminist for this because women are more
Almost. Almost.
Would you agree?
I'm tempted to call you old.
So there's that, and now this year, 2 new books have come out for other neighborhoods which are solving their own interesting problems. One is called Crossing Broadway, which is about Washington Heights, and how that's coming together. And the other one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's by Tari Hum, who's a Korean lady who teaches at Urban Studies in Queens College, and it's about Sunset Park in Brooklyn, the Chinese and coming together with Mexicans. And this stuff was unprecedented. It's happening now. And I'm very optimistic. It's very different from my childhood. Very, very different. So,
That kind of optimism.
I'm happy.
Hi, I work with Kalin, for Wildfire, and just a little bit of context, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very interesting to hear, I heard the tail end of Broadway Triangle discussion, and I think the forces that they're up against are just, they're so ingrained. And so I think the big difference between Western Brooklyn and the Rockaways is kind of in the chronology of things, when this became desirable land for development. And so people were saying, it was like where poor people in city housing were warehoused for many decades. This is housing policy since the early 50s. There was this environmental impact study in 2003. So clearly developers have been looking at this one piece of land since before that, but in sitting on it, and there's been this kind of tipping point, I think, where suddenly this place that wasn't desirable, that in Arthur Miller play in the 1980s, was described as the Siberia of New York, is somehow it's now getting closer to Manhattan, and developers are talking about, you can fly to JFK, and hopefully there'll be a ferry service. You get to Wall Street in an hour. So it's as the city expands, it's seemingly psychologically closer and closer. But I think the reason some of us got very interested in the potential development of this piece of land is that it'll also set a precedent for further development in the Rockaways. But there's been this, as Paul and Kalin mentioned, this Urban by the Sea development in the 2000s, the first big development in quite a while. And so this will be kind of maybe the next step. And so our interest in being engaged in this is that whatever happens here could be hopefully a model for kind of development that won't lead to displacement.
Kalin, you included the community benefits agreement before. What kind of stuff is in the Rockaway community benefits agreement?
So I should say that's a draft. First of all, it's so we kind of worked for a long time doing a lot of the general community organizing of residents who weren't necessarily parts of organizations, and we surveyed several hundred residents into what they wanted. So the priorities that emerged from that were jobs and job training, training for jobs and careers really. So we're looking at, and the council person there is already talking about there being a job training center, but trying to make sure that it's training for careers and industry, and kind of paired up with industry growth as well. So can we bring union of apprenticeships?
Is it local industry that we're talking about, or is it just industry?
Both a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of looking at green industry, new sort of energy, solar energy, thing. We would like for that to be the Rockaways, but and we're talking with trying to figure out can we bring trades union pre-apprenticeship programs to the Rockaways. Union, you already said you got a career. So looking at that, so there's the exact component of job training, making sure any job development go to like a high percentage, and not just first round hires, which is sometimes you see in other ones. That they still first time around they'll hire local folks, and then those people leave or are fired, and then they hire whoever they want. So there's that. Then there's the housing part of it.
Wait,
so,
can I just stop you for a second? So there's a really successful example of a community benefits agreement in East New York. It's the community organization is called the East New York Development Corporation, and they actually negotiated with the developer of a mall here in Gateway, Urban Renewal Area. The mall developers got the land for free from the city, and these folks from the community basically came to them, and it's not a big agreement over a lot of things. It's just very focused on, okay, you're gonna build a mall, we're gonna tell you who's gonna work there. And they've set themselves up to be actually funded by the developers of the mall to do hiring for all of the businesses that are actually leasing from the mall, and they got a 6-year contract. They got 6 years worth of funding for 6 or 8 staff people to just go out in the community, do job fairs, and then make sure that when the Panera moves into the mall, the people who work from the Panera come literally. Their CBA formed that organization, and they have that one mission, and maybe they'll grow into doing other things, but for the moment they're super single-mindedly focused on making sure that the mall employees are from the area.
Yeah, and I mean, because like there's going to be commercial and residential and recreational stuff. Part of the development is a little bit broader. So like the other ones are like the housing piece, making sure that it's first priority given to people displaced by Sandy first, and then current residents who want to relocate for any reason, and that it's affordable for people who live in the immediate area.
So it is immediate area, not moving to kind of
We haven't done
western
that.
part of
We're
Rockaway,
looking,
so-
I mean, like the draft as it stands now, which is of course, so probably be changed. We looked at the area, we gave income of the 11691 and 11692 zip codes, which is significantly less than the whole peninsula or like the larger area around. And that's kind of what we're working on now, but yeah,
Yeah, and just to answer your direct question, we're looking at income bands, not specifically where people are moving from, except for specific groups of people, like people who lost their housing in Sandy, or people who are being displaced by the active Edgemere Urban Renewal Plan.
Yeah, and then real popular other things are like community space, like designated community space that is available for locals to use, free of charge. That also green building, high green building standards is actually already part of the plan, so that's cool.
Yeah, but
And
we
then-
still want a contract.
Yeah, but we
then
want- we
then
want
we
it in
can
there.
follow through on it.
Yeah, and then folks, the last thing that folks were really interested in is that there being sort of storm resilient, and there being a hub that folks can go to, like an evacuation hub. Is something that there was really brought up a lot in our meetings. So we're trying to figure out how to work that into.
And the other thing that will be, if we get this contract with the developer, one thing that is really promising about it is that we can set a timeline. So one of the things that happened with Arbor by the Sea is the housing was built first, and the YMCA was built 10 years ago, right? And the YMCA is supposed to be this community benefit, but if they had gotten an actual contract with a timeline in it, that said, okay, great, like build the Y first, build the shopping center first, then build the housing, then that would have been, build the school, yeah, exactly. But so that's a lot of that is the focus on that, because of course this is, investor-driven development at the end of the day, so they can always say, well, we ran out of money, right? Our investors ran out of money, and if you don't set a timeline that puts a priority on the projects that are the ones that serve the whole new and old neighborhood, then there's a good chance that you're never going to get those at all.
Yeah, I know what happened at Wilkes Point. It's like the affordable housing got pushed like 25 years. So like, we're the people who are going to be in the neighborhood to make sure that happens 25 years later. And then also some of it was tied to DOT work. Like, oh, well, we don't have to build this until the Department of Transportation builds this extra, on-ramp from the Van Wyck or something. So then it's like tied to another government agency that who knows when that will ever happen. And that is, whatever the community does is trying to then pushing DOTs. So all of those kinds of things can happen and happen really quickly. Because there were people who thought that they had negotiated affordable housing.
That's why, like, I remember from last week, Francis Golden from Cooper Square was like, it's so important for organizers to have really great professionals. And I like totally took the way, she's like, your lawyers and your advisors and, need to be like super on point. So that's like such an important, like that partnership between community organizers and whether it be urban planners or attorneys or engineers or whoever it is, like it's so key. Yeah, it's all in the details.
With these community benefit agreements, like if the developer like doesn't do something, like they don't meet the timeline, or they don't, how what are you able to do? How is that
Sue them
work?
in court.
You sue them
It's a
and
contract.
Then, okay. And then like they just have to do it.
They might get, they might get some kind of judicially supervised settlement that's different than the contract, but yeah.
Gotta sign the contract.
Well, just like at one point, they don't have to. So it's interesting. It's like the leverage that the community has is basically in being legitimate and having, perception of being a meaningful body that the developer has to work with. So, it's in the developer's best interest to not appear to be working against the will of the community. But that's really, that's largely the leverage.
Because they already have the permission that they want from the government, so this is not necessarily related to that.
And it's a private battle, as we've been talking about. Like they're just buying property.
Well, no, they're getting free land from the city.
Yeah, that as well. Okay.
No, so that's it. That's where the land is coming from. It costs them $0. 81 acres for $0.
Okay.
That's what urban renewal plans are. They're transfers of property to somebody who's going to make the land more economically valuable.
But my guess is that they're also buying private properties in the surrounding area.
No, they're not. It's 81 acres. It's gigantic.
Okay.
They're not.
Yeah, it's a lot of property.
It's a lot of property. It's a unitary project, and they have the development rights. But what the community has, in addition to its kind of legitimacy, is the ability to oppose it, right? And so what we need in order to be really in a position to insist on this contract is people in the neighborhood have to be willing to block the project, to say, we're not going to let you do this without a contract. And that's the key, right? Is this only works if everybody's working together. If you're in a position with the community, they're going to show up at the mayor's office. They're going to show up at the council member's office. They're going to go sit in front of the bulldozer. They're going to show up at all of your press conferences. They're going to show up at your kid's school.
I don't mean
right?
to push this again, but what about the Dunkin' Donuts that have opened all along the strip of Rockaway? You don't count that as private entities coming in?
That's not what's happening on the 81 acres of the Urban Renewal. The land that's up for grabs is free land from the city. That was a neighborhood that was cleared 50 years ago. There's other development happening, absolutely. But the land that's up for grabs is this land that was put out for proposal in 2005 by the city. And this development team responded to it under those conditions, right? Before Sandy, before it was really clear that Urban by the Sea wasn't actually, even though there was this big community preference number in their marketing, it actually wasn't going to serve the community because at that point, most of the housing wasn't built, they weren't marketing yet, right? So at that moment, it was maybe less egregious or something, but in the present, it's very clear that if nobody intervenes, it will be more housing that is for people who are not from the neighborhood. There's certainly other development happening in Rockaway.
And people buying up nearby properties. Yeah.
But not the same people.
And why does the city give it away for free? Instead of
Because they're not paying for it to be developed. It's private money and it's paying for it to be developed, and they can say building affordable housing or making tax revenue off of it. That's what they're really interested in, making tax revenue off of it. So it's empty, they don't.
And the city just wants to offload the land.
they don't have a good system for managing vacant public land, which is why my organization like intervenes in that system, because there's just, otherwise they don't even market opportunities to create open spaces where open spaces were planned, right? Where somebody lost their house because it was part of an urban renewal area to create a park, but that park was never built. And so the city just sits on this land in their inventory and they don't even try to do anything about it because there's no real they. The agency that holds the land is not the Parks Department. Right?
So is it the city, technically, or it's the state?
It's the city.
City?
It's the city.
Although here also, something that's particular to our release is because there's such great infrastructure costs, the city, they are asking for $120 million from the city to cover the infrastructure costs. And we're like waiting on that decision. They might say they might not give that money, and the whole development plan could just kind of go down the drain. Like it could, like in theory, that could happen in a few months. We can all do other things.
That area.
Well, I mean, they did say it, but at one point, I mean, the city did pay for a lot of infrastructure, sewers, et cetera, that like, so there's a lot of talk about how the private developers are going to remediate and all that, but they don't count how much money the city is actually putting in.
We do have one last go around. Any final thoughts? Or Kalin, do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
I have a quick question. What exactly is being done to remediate the flushing bay?
Actually, I just attended a meeting about that.
But I don't know.
There's something called, a state organization called Blue something. We had a presentation at Flushing Town Hall this past week.
That was Riverkeeper did the presentation.
Yeah, Riverkeeper, that's it. And they know what they're talking about. I made a couple of comments and they knew about it.
Wait, so what are they doing?
What are they doing?
You should. I think
Do you remember?
It seemed to be okay.
It's Riverkeeper teamed up with like some boat people as well, right? Is that what it is?
We're not talking about yet now.
Do you know exactly what they're doing? Like,
There's a whole mandate for anything to do with housing. And I can go back to Pete Siegel with that.
So, as Kalin was saying earlier, the Upward Coalition has been this project of building a community coalition to actually have kind of a place to put, hopefully, some binding agreements over this development. And the coalition's it's taken about 2 years to get it to this stage, and it's just real enough that I can like put it in a program. The bylaws haven't quite been voted on yet, but the same 25 people or so keep showing up to meetings like twice a week. So it's pretty cool, but this is actually our first time really talking about it to anybody that's not actually a member of the coalition. So what do you guys think? How are we doing?
do you guys?
They're commissioned by the city from specialists who just do. Sometimes those specialists are also owned by the developers, as happened in the Atlantic
That's what I expected.
Terminal
Just
Urban Renewal
curious.
Area, and that's what paved the way for Parkways.
It's probably what's going to pay the way for the Rockaways, unfortunately.
Well, no, that already happened. So the thing is that like that's all in the past, which is kind of good for us.
2006?
2003.
2003 one, okay.
Yeah.
It's a leverage point for us, and we really wanted to push and say, well, Hurricane Sandy has happened since 2003. We need to have a new EIS.
Yeah.
It's like a very like costly, long process, and we certainly want to do that.
So just a quick question in terms of kind of, there are moments in these things where it's really important to have a lot of people around, and then there are moments in these campaigns where like core people who know a lot and thought about the things and were negotiating with the entities. Like that seems to be where you are right now. So like how do you keep the energy of organizing people to make sure that if you do need them when you need to get in front of the wrecking ball or whatever it is that it'll take for them to sign such an agreement? Like how do you keep that going in this kind of like quiet period, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I I've been really impressed with the grassroots organizations that have shown up to become the steering committee of Upward. And those are all organizations that have existing memberships.
Big bases.
And big bases, and I think that's our secret weapon. Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, we did. I mean, that was a conscious decision to have a coalition of existing, and we're talking about often very small community organization, rather than a kind of forming a thing where like anyone.
So your coalition is citywide? Or it's specifically Rockaway? Okay, I'm sorry.
We do have some organizations that are citywide but have local chapters.
Okay.
CDH is one of
Like
those.
CVH,
Okay,
Voice
those-
Heard, and Faith in New York. And they have bases in Rockaway, so like that's we kind of like in the thick of this like bylaws process, so we really have put a lot of the like broader organizing on the back burner while we're trying to navigate this. But I think like the next step once that's done is probably to have another large community forum where we can just like promote it, invite as many people as we can to say, hey, sort of like a coming out party for the Upward Coalition, and like this is what we're working on, and we want to keep everyone abreast, and we want to make sure that you know that you're welcome to come and observe the meetings and participate and be part of the process. And I think that that's going to be really important. So like finding that balance between, because there's a lot of work, it's like really intense. Like finding the balance between like the coalition work and making sure we're always going back to the community. Maybe like for now, maybe like a month.
So you guys suggest and then like if both those things happen and people that's not
That's a linear. So we're in a position where as soon as we have a real entity that can sign a contract, we've been in a very open conversation with the development team for the last 2 years. They were very aware that we're doing this. They want us to. Because they think, oh, all these organized people can help us get the infrastructure money we need to actually make our project move forward. So as soon as we're in a place where we feel secure about internal decision making, it's also a little bit dangerous, right? Because we do have like Kalin and I personally have very good relationships with the development team, and that's great. But we don't really want to take the conversation any further without knowing what the internal structure is of the coalition, so we know what to take it back to. And then we can start to work together with them potentially to push the city to make that infrastructure money available if we're really on the same page, right? If we can sit down with them and say like, okay, well, here are the things that we want. Can we sign a preliminary contract, and then we'll show up for you, as long as what you want and what we want is the same.
so like the trigger then is the like finalizing a legitimate decision maker, like whatever shape that may take.
Yeah. Or if the city comes out and makes an announcement that this project is moving forward, then we just have to kind of hustle, right? Then we have to say like, oh, then we might have to like say like, oh, we're gonna block it unless this and that and the other thing.
And so that's sort of been like informing the coalition to be like, there's an urgency here, people, like, let's not take 6 months to write bylaws. Like, it's important to build a solid foundation, but also like, let's be ready.
Is like the hope to turn it into like a 501c3 type of organization?
It doesn't matter so much, right? If there will certainly be, if all goes well, there will certainly be probably more than one new 501c3 or type organization that's born, or cooperative organization, or there'll be cooperative housing. That's all down the line. The hope is to have an organization with bylaws that every organizational member has signed on to.
How close do you feel like you are?
We're real close. Close enough to talk about it at the museum.
Yeah. But also we're like at a very critical point with the coalition. Like we're still like there's we're still building trust in that world with all the different organizations. And there's a lot of people who are like so used to being screwed over that it's they're not very trusting necessarily. So we told them like we've had some preliminary talks with the developers. But we're not going to talk to the developers anymore until we're approaching them as a coalition. We've got to get a coalition shit together before we can do that. So we're sort of in this
feels like it's really like, it's,
That's awesome. Good. Congratulations.
Yeah, we're gonna cross your fingers. And if anybody live in Rockaway? Thursday nights. What's that place called?
Florentino Center for the Parks Department, like gym building.
okay.
In the basement.
Yeah, I'll email you. I make it like it's every Thursday.
Talk about like chronology and the changing kind of dynamics, external pressures. Also, we started thinking about this in a totally different political context. We seemingly, in the Bloomberg administration, in which we saw at first as a kind of like resistance effort, and there's obviously an element of that. But then one thing that really resonated with me, hearing people from Triangle, Broadway Triangle, is that right now is like the kind of optimal political conditions, and having a mayor who has desire for affordable housing, start a big program, and you can't, someone may just be lip service, but we have a city council who said things like the beach will not be gentrified, and so it's up to us to hold them to that, but we have a chance now, I think, to work cooperatively, but there's a window of time, and there's also the people who are elected officials are also accountable in that regard.
Ask one more question. Are you like,
We're in your house.
I could say you're like, question about the developers specifically and like what you know about them based on like how they've dealt with other communities or insinuating groups.
So it's a funny thing because they're a team and they've never done anything before together. And they responded to an RFP in 2005.
It's L&M.
It's L&M, Bluestone, and Triangle Equities. And they got together and responded to a city request for proposals in 2005. As far as I know, L&M and Bluestone have never worked on a project together before. And they actually have really different orientations. So I'm also really I'm so curious about how that's gonna go.
I mean, in mentioning L&M, I've heard, well, as far as developers go, they're pretty good. That's not saying much. But then I've also heard that, like, from people at Mutual Housing in New York and New York's Communities for Change and Cooper Square, like, L&M, they're buying up all the land that they possibly can. They're super in with the mayor's office.
They're the designated developer for Essex Crossing. Alone.
Right.
So they're very powerful. So, they've got, it's money signs in their eyes. Like, and then he's like really friendly, which is weird. It's like, don't be friendly. It's messing money.
You don't want to hate them. We just want them to follow the business.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess like at the end of the day, it's gonna be about the bottom line, and so that's
Her
what.
face on development, it's gonna look like Lucifer, like very handsome and nice. Yeah.
Elvis?
Like a handsome blackjack dealer.
Yeah.
I keep playing. It's always stacked in their favor.
Kalin, thank you for letting us do this. And thank you guys for sticking it out. Have you guys, has anybody been here since noon? Yeah, me too.
It's my job.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, well, so come back next
So
week.
there's 2 more weeks, right?
Come back next week and there's going to be a really fantastic set of programs. We're screening The Rink, which is actually about a skating rink in New York in a neighborhood in flux, which I haven't seen, so I'm really excited to see it. And then the conversation about what happens to a neighborhood renewed is actually a conversation about SPURA and the creation of the community planning boards, the Stewart Park Urban Renewal Area in Manhattan, and the creation of the community planning boards. And my colleague Amy Laurent-Kahn from Philadelphia, who represents the Eastwick residents who live in the largest urban renewal plan area in the country, and are continuing to fight their own displacement and the environmental hazards that led to their own community being called blighted in the first place. It's a complicated, kind of amazing story. So and she's joining us from Philadelphia. To talk about that, Damon Rich is going to do an artist talk in the Panorama that focuses on urban renewal from 49 to 74, and actually the establishment of like the machine for taking federal money and creating the city without a ghetto, and how that actually worked in practice. And then for redlining and gentrification, it's folks from the University of Orange in Orange, New Jersey, who have done a lot of studies on the overlap between the insurance industry, treatment of different neighborhoods, and different color coding and redlining, and how that led directly to the kind of disinvestment that was then later called blight, and made a great film. So
It's interesting that you have Damon next to that because
they're carpool. They're in sync. The shared transportation.
Damon did an intervention on the Panorama also where he put down kind of markers for where closures were happening, and that was done in 2009. And like what was interesting about it was that you overlaid the red line maps, which is pretty much what happened. So what you had was like the same banks that were denying people credit for
And offering them
predatory credit, you know. Yeah. So we called it the Red Lines Housing Crisis Learning Center. But, you know, it was pretty intense how well they matched. And so like to really think about kind of the many ways certain neighborhoods get screwed and how like some of the same people are doing it.
And it's how it's an extraction.
Don't worry, the next generation's there.
Anyway, so that's next week. It'll be really fun. The following week, I'm going to do a little what have we learned so far presentation, and then we're going to show a short film and have a closing reception. And the exhibit is up anytime the museum is open, so if you know people, send them.